Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar, Environmental Monitoring, to Swab or Not to Swab. My name's Amy. I'm a member of the marketing team at Perry Johnson Registrars Food Safety, Inc. I'll be facilitating today's webinar and offering technical support to our speakers. Today, we're very excited to be welcoming two guest speakers from the industry for today's presentation, and I'll be introducing them to you all a little later on in the broadcast. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few brief housekeeping notes. To ensure audio quality, all attendees are on mute. However, we do absolutely want to take any questions you might have. So to ask a question, just go ahead and open the Questions tab of the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen, type your question in and click Send. We'll collect those, and at the end of the prepared slides, we'll answer as many as we have time for. Two of the most frequent questions we get are, where can I get the slides, or will a recording be available? And yes, the webinar is being recorded today. That will be available from the PJRFSI YouTube channel, usually within the next day or two. And these slides will be available to download from the PJRFSI website. So keep an eye out for those if you wanted to maybe share the recording with someone who couldn't attend or send it out to your team. Please feel free to share it around. And this is just showing what it might look like on your screen when you open that question tab. You can go ahead and type in that question, send it off to us, and we will hopefully get to answer all of them. Before we introduce today's first speaker, I do have a quick polling question just to get to know the audience. And that first question is your organization currently certified to a GFSI standard? So just choose whichever option suits you and your organization best. And once we've gotten some participation, we'll move right along in introducing the first speaker. And for those of you who might be trickling in as we get started, welcome to the webinar, and thank you for taking the time to join us. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this polling question now that we've gotten some good participation in. And it looks like the majority of those attending today are certified to a GFSI standard, which is always great to see. All right, I'm going to go ahead and introduce now Paul Demarin. He is the Senior Vice President of Food Safety and Supply Chain here at PJRFSI. Paul joined us last January and has over 35 years of experience in the hospitality, service, and retail agri-food sectors. Paul's a board member of the Ontario Food Safety Association and an advisory council member with the George Washington University School of Business for their digital marketing certificate program. Before he came to PJRFSI, Paul worked for 16 years in the certification industry with clients in every sector from food safety and supply chain to brand protection and quality. Paul's worked for many years in management system certification, and before that, Paul was a professional chef and a consultant for over 20 years. So without further ado, Paul, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Amy. I appreciate that. Welcome everyone today. Thank you very much for taking the time to spend an hour with us this afternoon. I'm extremely excited to be back in the swing of our webinar schedule that started last week. We have a very busy 5 months ahead of us and packed schedule, so we look forward to you joining for future webinars as well. There's a lot to unpack today during this webinar, so I'm going to start with, as I always do, with a very short overview of our company. And I also have the pleasure of welcoming two very special guests, a close colleague of mine in the industry for many years, an executive vice president and general counsel with Matrix Sciences International, Inc., Melanie Newman, and Dr. Martin Weidman, who's a professor at Cornell University and going to be talking about environmental monitoring. So let's jump right in. Just to tell you a little bit about our company, PJR, or Perry Johnson Registrars, was founded by Perry himself in 1994. They've been at the forefront of certification and registration from the very beginning, going back to the early 90s. They achieved multiple accreditations during that time with ANAB and ANSI and UCAS. That was around 1995. From then, we started expanding overseas to many markets, everywhere from Japan and Brazil to Spain, Portugal, Germany, Canada, Latin America, Thailand. We have a family of companies actually, and Perry Johnson Registrars is on the management system certification side. PJRFSI is on the food safety and supply chain side. We also have PJLA, which is our laboratory accreditation business, and that was founded in 1999. And that's where we accredit laboratories globally to standards like ISO 17025. In 2005, we launched a company called PJ&A, and that's our healthcare and technology company. They do things like medical transcription, coding, telemedicine. And then in 2012, so 9 years ago, we launched Perry Johnson Food Safety Inc. And that was really as a demand because in the industry, there were a lot of needs, as everyone knows, for food safety certification and standards. We're headquartered in Troy, Michigan, but we do operate globally. We have offices around the world in over 60 countries, and we offer services from everything from first, second, and third party inspections to FDA required audits, social accountability, cybersecurity, you name it. So talking about the food supply chain, over the last 9 years, we've really worked with companies in every sector in the industry. Everybody from retailers to processors, importers and exporters, distribution companies, and many other types to help them manage their food safety, quality, brand, and supply chain requirements. We're very committed here, obviously, at Perry Johnson Registrars Food Safety to bring you information that is relevant and timely to industry. We want to be looked at and known as a thought leader in the industry, and we're doing that as we're doing here today by partnering with experts in the industry to bring this information to you. So as I mentioned, we're in 60 countries around the world. We have about 460 assessors that we work with and about 30 different programs within the agri-food group right now. Our auditors, they're well positioned around the world to, really benefit you and your organization in many ways, but the auditors not only understand the language, but equally important, the culture of these countries and the regulations as well. We do have an outstanding client attrition rate, extremely low, the lowest I've ever seen, about 1.7% per year. And in the past 5 years, we've received a very high customer service rating as well from our customers, so we're quite proud of that. Now, if you take a look at, last year with COVID in 2020, certification industry at that time was deemed an essential service because organizations, like many of you today, still require certification, and it's based on the results of tests and inspections, and audits give confidence to you and me as the consumer that the organization's products or company that you're buying from and their systems are being evaluated against national and international standards. But again, it's not business as usual, and it hasn't been for a very long time. We're looking to provide you with safe, high quality services and solutions, and to do our part to try and reduce the impact of COVID-19. We divide our areas into 4 key solutions for our customers. We do auditing and certification to accredited third-party standards like GFSI or ISO 9001 as an example. We do second-party unaccredited auditing as well, and this would be standards that we as the CB own, like a GMP audit or good distribution or HACCP, but they're not accredited. But many times customers will use those because they've been technically vetted. They're kind of a plug and play type of audit, and they meet the requirements and regulatory requirements. And then we do customer specific work as well, where customers will have their own audit protocol and they will ask us to conduct these audits on their behalf. So as I mentioned, we do have about 30 different programs on the food safety side of the house. There are many different types of audits that are happening in the industry today. Some are accredited like GFSI, some are unaccredited like a GMP. There are some client specifics, government regulated, retailer mandated. There's still many. We talked about the first, second, and third party audits, but we also are recognized as an accredited body to perform various government audits, like the line you see on the bottom there, FSMA, FSVP, or the VQIP program, which is the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. And then just kind of wrapping this up here, we've had a long-standing relationship with many of the accreditation bodies and scheme owners here. We're recognized around the world, and really accreditation gives customers confidence that the group of companies that we represent operate under the rules of accreditation, and the scheme owners as well, which helps to regulate our side of the business and maintain a high quality of our work. So it's a large investment that is made each year by PJR, FSI, as well as I'm sure many CBs. but it's well worth it because at the end of the day, it gives customers confidence that they're partnering with a recognized and respected partner. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time today. Again, I just want to thank you all very much for joining us. I'm very excited about this next portion here, and hopefully before long we'll be able to see each other's smiling faces again in person. And once again, thank you so much for your time. I'll pass it back to you, Amy.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. Before we introduce the next speaker, I do have another polling question. And this one is, what risks do you think should typically be targeted in an environmental monitoring program? Unfortunately, there is a typo here. You can only choose one. So choose whichever one you feel most strongly about. Obviously, there isn't all of the above option. So go ahead and vote away over there. Your responses to all of these polls are anonymous, so feel free to answer however you wish. And once we get some participation there, I will move right along in introducing our next speaker. To those of you who might have joined us late, if you missed the first portion of the presentation, there will be a recording available to view on the PGRFSI YouTube channel, and these slides will also be available for download from the pgrfsi.com website. So don't worry if you missed the first section. All right. And it does look like we've got some great participation going on here. So thank you to all who voted. And that's how the votes came out. So it looks like a combination of people looking mostly at environmentally transmitted pathogens or all of the above, which had 50%. So moving right along. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Martin Weidman. Martin received a veterinary degree and a doctorate in veterinary medicine from the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich and a PhD in food science from Cornell, where he's currently the Gellert Family Professor of Food Safety. His research interests focus on farm-to-table microbial food quality and food safety and the application of molecular tools to study the transmission of foodborne pathogens and spoilage organisms. His team has published 400 peer-reviewed publications, which have been cited over 10,000 times. He and his team are regularly asked to help the industry with a range of microbial food safety and quality challenges. He received the Young Scholars Award from the American Dairy Science Association in 2002, the Samuel Kate Prescott Award from the Institute of Food Technologists in 2003, the International Life Science Institute North America Future Leaders Award in 2004, and the American Meat Institute Foundation Scientific Achievement Award in 2011. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a fellow of the Institute of Food Technologists, a fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology, and a member of the International Academy of Food Science and Technology. So Martin, it is a great honor to be able to welcome you today. Thank you for taking the time to present for us, and you can go ahead and take it away whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. To swab or not to swab? And we're not talking about nose swabs for COVID testing today. We're talking about environmental swabs in food processing facilities. Let's see if I can advance my slides here. Good. So take-home messages. What do I want you to remember after this presentation today? First, I want you to remember that we are in a situation where many food safety issues, the majority of food safety issues that we see, really track back to failures of prerequisite programs, not our critical control points, our heat treatments, or our kill steps. And with that comes that the processing plant environment and other food-associated environments, that might be farm, might be packing house, are important sources of pathogens and spoilage organisms that we need to monitor better. How do we achieve that? Swabbing is a key tool there. We should have swabbing programs, or better called environmental monitoring programs, that validate and verify these prerequisite programs, whether it's sanitation, sanitary equipment design, zoning, etc. The other thing, for those of you working in industry, what my hope is that at least some of you go back or to your facility or facilities and review your swabbing programs. Make sure it has the defined goals we're going to talk about. Make sure you improve the integration of your programs that may currently be separately run. I hope I'll convince you that it will be a good idea to not have pathogen monitoring and ATP run by completely different departments. And maybe I even convince you that it's time to get an external party to stress test and evaluate your environmental monitoring system to make sure it really meets your goals. So what is swabbing? I actually don't like the term. I think we're better off calling it pathogen environmental monitoring program for those programs that focus on pathogens, or what I prefer, environmental monitoring programs, to emphasize the comprehensive nature of these programs that includes everything from pathogens to indicate and index organisms, such as Enterobacteriaceae, aerobic plate counts, ATP, to even allergens. The other reason I don't like the term that much is that when we talk about pathogen environmental monitoring, we actually use sponges, not swabs, like shown in the left. Why? We can sample much bigger surfaces much more effectively, and therefore have a much more sensitive way to detect pathogens and issues in our processing plant environment. So why do we swab? The goal of an environmental monitoring program typically is to assure the hygienic conditions of the processing environment and to prevent contamination of foods from the processing plant environment. What does that mean? That we need to have robust environmental monitoring programs, basically for any processing facilities where we have ready-to-eat products that are exposed to the processing environment after the kill step, our heat treatment. If we don't have a kill step, such as in produce, we need to have them throughout the chain, including probably tracing back to packing houses. What are the key hazards as we look at food safety that we manage with environmental monitoring programs? What are these environmentally transmitted pathogens that 41% of you said we're trying to monitor? It's Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, and then Gronobacter in those facilities that process infant formula or infant formula ingredients. Another hazard that we actually monitor with these and address with this is allergens. We sometimes forget that, and often we manage it as a separate program. And I'm going to try to make a point, or at least ask you to consider it. Should we really look at those programs more together, pathogen and allergens? Because some of our controls, cleaning, sanitation, address both of them. The other risk that is managed with environmental monitoring programs, and it's not a hazard because we're not talking about food safety, is spoilage risks. Because the processing plant environment also is often the source of spoilage organisms that can cause problems and cause recalls. Here are some examples of the spoilage part, and these are two issues we were involved. One of them where we could identify the processing plant environment as the source of Pseudomonas that significantly reduced the shelf life of fluid milk produced in that facility. In the other case, it was environmental contamination with Pseudomonas fluorescens that actually turned cheese, and in this case it was a fresh Hispanic style cheese, but the same issue has been reported for mozzarella, blue, with massive consequences for the companies in terms of recalls, loss of consumer confidence, and loss of export markets in some of these cases. So the monitoring environment will not just prevent these food safety issues, but also reduce the exposure to quality issues. So let's take a little bit deeper why we swab. I think when you ask facilities, when you ask QA manager, it often is like broad goals, like, we want to control Listeria, we want to verify sanitation, but often we don't have coordinated programs with clear goals and clear metrics that are linked to risk management, where we can say, this is our goal and this is how it manages specific risk. And Melanie is going to talk a little later about how to link these programs to enterprise risk management. I want you to take home from this that it might be time to better integrate and coordinate your different environmental monitoring program. One strategy, one idea for this might be to rethink your programs, reorganize and reinvigorate them by looking at them with regard to their use for, number one, validation, and number two, verification of your pathogen control strategies, of your hazard control strategies. And that could be validation, verification of sanitation, sanitary equipment design, etc. As we embark on this short journey to think about environmental monitoring programs with regard to verification and validation, let's review these two concepts and let's make it clear how I use these two words. To me, they're very distinct parts of developing and monitoring a food safety system. Validation is to have scientific data to make sure you're doing the right thing. You're doing what's needed to do to reduce your risk to the extent necessary. Verification means you're consistently implementing this validated system. So validation may only happen once every 3 years. It may happen rarely. Verification is continuous, okay? Now, in many cases, particularly with environmental monitoring, the lines between those two are blurred, and people may not be able to clearly communicate to you whether they're really talking about validation or verification when they do these activities, when they go out and swab. And to be honest, it is probably a lot more difficult with environmental monitoring to think about it with regard to validation and verification. A simple example of these two concepts applied to food safety would be heat treatment. Our validation for pasteurization would be scientific data that showed a certain time temperature combination provides a certain reduction of the pathogens of concern. Our verification is continuous recording of temperature and flow rate, which gives us a measure of time, so that we can show every single carton of beverage, every single carton of milk that gets out of the facility actually received that validated kill step. Now, how do we apply these concepts to environmental monitoring? When I go into a facility and push people, say, okay, so you're doing sanitation, you're doing verification, let's say with ATP. How do you actually, if I'm going to ask you, show me your sanitation validation, what are you going to give me? Most people are stumped with that question. And sometimes they go back, well, our sanitizer company, our provider of these, the chemical provider, has some data that show a 5 log reduction. Now, if you go back, what does that really mean? Well, that's a lab experiment on a 2x2 inch clean metal chip that shows you can get 5 log reduction with, let's be honest, essentially no application to the real world application of these sanitizers in a processing facility. So how do you get a real validation that your sanitation works, that it assures a clean break, which is necessary for you to be able to limit your recall to 1 day versus without a validated sanitation, where you may have to recall multiple days, weeks, and months because you cannot prove that you can confine contamination to a single lot. What we have seen, and some companies do this is not just academic, and I have to say that because I'm from academia, this is done in the real world, is there are procedures, and people have even standard operating procedures for how to validate sanitation standard operating procedures. What does it typically entail? You have a piece of equipment, you have your SOP, your sanitation standard operating procedure. You follow that for cleaning and sanitation. You assemble your equipment, as you usually do. You start running your equipment if you can, dry run it, but you don't put product on it. Then you stop, disassemble, and use a combination of ATP to validate cleaning, total plate count, aerobic plate count, whatever you want to call it, to verify sanitation, maybe even some pathogen testing, even though it's typically not necessary. Then you disassemble further to the extent possible. That will tell you whether your sanitation really reaches those deep, difficult to reach spots in your complex piece of equipment. Envision, a filler, a slicer, etc. And if you really come away with clean, in air quotation mark, ATP total plate count, that shows that you have an SSOP that really completely cleans and sanitizes your piece of equipment. If you find spots where you have residual high level of ATP, total plate counts, that means your standard SOP probably doesn't have enough disassembly. Your equipment might not be designed hygienically and might require redesign. It requires changes, so it becomes an iterative process until you have a validated SSOP that you can show is actually really cleaning and sanitizing your piece of equipment, allows you to really do that. I've heard companies that say validation for some of our pieces of equipment, a giant drying tower that's 40, 50 feet tall, might take us 24, 36, 48 hours. And it happens maybe once a year, maybe every 3 years. But then you have a system in place using environmental monitoring, using swabbing to truly validate your cleaning and sanitation procedures. Are you going to do this for your whole plant? No. Should you do it for key pieces of equipment? Absolutely. Complete disassembly, that's the tricky part of this. And this is why a good validation takes time. Even something like this wouldn't be considered valid complete disassembly. Why? Because your tires are still in your rims. This is a metal rubber interface which would be a way where bacteria could hide. What is this sort of validation exercise going to show you? It's going to find parts of your equipment, in this case, is a conveyor belt like this, where you have metal, rubber, metal, plastic interfaces that are not effectively cleaned without complete disassembly. You're going to change your SOPs to have complete disassembly. Maybe not daily, maybe once a week, but that's how you're going to improve your SSOP and validate it. Once you have that validated SSOP, then it's time for your verification testing. And that's your typical standard program that is mandated in some regulations, both in the US and in Canada, where it says you have to collect environmental samples 4 hours into processing. That's the programs where you do ATP right after sanitation. But that is typically a verification part, which is good, but it's not that useful if you don't have a validation to go with it. So hopefully I've convinced you that this is a way to look at it, but some of you say, you know what, we never had an issue before. We've done some swabbing, we've never gone through these excessive exercises that you propose here, Martin, and we haven't had an issue. Well, if that's where you fall, think again. The world around us has changed. We have whole genome sequencing that detects more outbreaks, and we have social media that makes spoilage incidents so much more impactful for your business. As one example, this shows what happened with whole genome sequencing with Listeria outbreaks detected. You can see after start of whole genome sequence in 2013, we've seen significantly more Listeria outbreaks detected than before. That's why you need to up your game with regard to validation, verification of prerequisite programs. If you look at social media, this is just one example. This is a Facebook post after a child consumed a Capri Sun, as you can see here, and realized it's tasted like alcohol. 27,000 likes, 400,000 shares, required a recall of Capri Sun and actually a redesign of the packaging. Huge cost to the brand. You know, maybe a little bit of stretch, but it's yeast contamination which comes from the environment. But it shows how social media can be used to take spoilage events that might only affect a few packages and have huge business impact that you can reduce with a good environmental monitoring program. Does this really work? And as I get into my last point, you need to stress test your system. These are some real data. These are 7 plants we worked with. We helped them set up an environmental monitoring program for Listeria. And at first look, if you look at their 1-year program performance, you can say some of them are really good. Plant F, no positives, 334 samples. Or maybe even Plant I, 1 positive out of 222. Maybe we like that one better because at least it found something once. And then some of them seem to be pretty bad. H, 23% positives. What we did, we went into these plants, did an independent checkup on the program, where we collected 50+ samples. Look what we found. Those facilities that looked like they did really well, 0 out of 334, we collected 50 samples, we found 3 positives. 1 out of 106, we collected 50, we found 7. Some of the facilities that didn't look that hot in their routine monitoring program, 23% positive. When we went in, we found 4% positives, considerably less than some of the facilities that looked really good on their routine program. What does that mean? The routine programs might not always be implemented right. People might not sample hard enough, might not look hard enough, etc. That's why you need to have an external stress test to make sure your program doesn't look like one of the facilities that we show in red here. So with that, back to our take-home messages. I'm not going to repeat them. You know, if you work in industry, look at those recommendations. Maybe something resonated with you, and maybe you're going to go back and try to make some changes, review some of your programs. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions after Melanie showed us why these programs are so important in the grander sense with regard to enterprise risk management.
All right, it looks like it's back over to me. Thank you so much, Martin, for the excellent presentation. We just have a quick polling question before we move on to Melanie's portion of the webinar. And that question is food safety on your company's list of top enterprise risks? So just choose whichever option applies to you best. Once again, all responses are anonymous during the webinar. And for those of you who may have missed the first portion of the presentation, a recording and the slides will be available from pdrfsi.com. If you have any questions that occur to you as the presentation is ongoing, please feel free to open the questions tab on the control panel on your screen, type your question in and send it our way, and we'll answer as many of them as we have time for at the end of the prepared slides. All right, thank you all for participating in that poll. Here's how you all voted. Thank you for sharing your feelings on that. And we're going to roll right along into introducing our next speaker. Melanie Newman is Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Matrix Sciences International, Inc. Matrix Sciences is a dynamic, multidisciplinary group of food safety and quality experts focusing on microbiological, chemistry, analytical, residue, and pesticide laboratory testing, sensory testing, data analytics, and food safety risk management advisory services. Melanie assists the food and beverage industry with regulatory, operational, and brand reputation risk management solutions, helping companies mitigate these risks in today's ever-changing regulatory landscape. Melanie also interacts with regulators, customers, media, and plaintiffs' attorneys in response to investigations, enforcement actions, outbreaks, recalls, and alleged illness claims on behalf of her clients to resolve issues and identify appropriate corrective actions. Melanie is a magna cum laude graduate of Mitchell Hamline Law School in St. Paul, Minnesota for her Juris Doctorate degree and Michigan State University for her MS in food safety. In her spare time, Melanie competes in Ironman long distance triathlons and has completed her eighth Ironman triathlon as of November 2019. Melanie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Can I just say wow at your list of accomplishments there?
Well, thank you, Amy. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here today with you, Perry Johnson Registrar, and everyone who is listening, as well as Dr. Weidman. Greatly appreciate the opportunity. And anyone can complete an Ironman if they put the training time in. That's my 2 cents on long course triathlon. With that, we're going to dive right in. I'm going to continue the conversation that Dr. Weidman had started with regard to this topic and try to paint a few additional broader strokes as to the importance of your environmental monitoring program, the reasons to swab, and how it really influences and shapes the conversation around your whole organizational risk, your entire enterprise risk. We've talked about that phrase a lot so far during this conversation. I'm going to continue the conversation with regard to that as soon as I figure out how to advance my slides.
You should have control of there you are. Yep. Yep. There you go.
Thank you very much. So I too start with the end in mind, similar to the prior presenter, to talk through a few key takeaways. So really, I would love for you to walk away with some understanding of how environmental monitoring programs inform our enterprise risk management process and program. And that sometimes we need to really give some conscious thought around translating hazards to risks. What I mean by that is, as food safety professionals, we manage hazards every day like listeria. How do we turn that conversation and translate that hazard to risk in a vocabulary that our risk managers, our CFOs, our CEOs, those who have the corporate enterprise risk management responsibility really understand and get right away? Like being able to turn that hazard to a risk in terms of dollars. For example, if we have a listeria problem that this causes a risk of a recall or foodborne illness outbreaks, that could total on average per some recent studies, $10 million. That's where we're going with this conversation and how the environmental monitoring programs and that data really can be turned into not just actionable information, but very influential information in getting the kind of time, talent, treasure, resources we need to best manage our risks in the totality of all risks throughout our enterprise, throughout our organizations. We'll talk a little bit about and give some examples on how to do that. And then we'll close with a little bit of a cautionary closing with regard to some other risk landmines to watch out for, to avoid, and certainly we can successfully do so and sidestep those landmines, provided that we're aware of them and are looking out for them. So Dr. Weidman gave you plenty of great reasons why to have an environmental monitoring program, and a very robust one that is pressure tested, challenged, that you feel confident in. And I think the primary reason for me as to why to have this kind of a robust EMP program is the 3 letters equal the 3 letters. Your EMP program really is your enterprise risk management program. If you view enterprise risk, at least in this piece of the conversation, with regard to your food safety program's enterprise risk. How is food safety in totality, if you're a corporate food safety professional looking at, 17 different production facilities and how that information is flowing to you, your EMP information and results really can tell a very quick, very colorful story for you to be able to serve as early warning indicators if something's going outside the guardrails, right? It helps us understand and catch a hazard turning into a risk, hopefully before we distributed product, for example. So it's very influential, and it really gives us that early warning red flag with regards to Houston. We might have a problem. There's an enterprise level risk that might be associated here. And here's the reasons why, and we'll talk through that in a little more detail here. If that's not enough, you just might be required to keep some environmental monitoring data depending upon the jurisdiction that you manufacture or produce products in, and or the jurisdictions where you distribute to. So Dr. Weidman had mentioned, Canada, the US have certain requirements. There's other requirements with regard to where you're domiciled and making food, where you're distributing that food. But in a nutshell, for example, the FDA, FSMA, requires environmental monitoring in certain circumstances as a verification activity, not to be confused as a preventive control, which I do see often, a bit of confusion that, oh, environmental monitoring is a preventive control. Now, monitoring doesn't actually reduce or eliminate the hazard. It verifies where you're at on that scale of, do you have a hazard that's ticking out of control? And so really the requirements here on the slide, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but ultimately that sweet spot of where we need to focus is post-kill step, post-processing basically, and exposed product where there's no further kill step prior to packaging or in packaging. So with that, we also have USDA testing requirements as well, depending upon what alternative you are under USDA FSIS guidelines. These requirements or frequencies could range everywhere from, twice a year per line, all the way up to 1 time a month per line, or even more, depending upon the risk of your food. And so while we don't want to lose sight of regulatory requirements, we also don't want to lose sight of the fact that that's the floor, right? That's minimum barrier to entry to enter into playing the game of food, right? None of us really want to build our programs to only meet minimum regulatory requirements. We're striving for more, and that's exactly what environmental monitoring programs that are robust and comprehensive can deliver for us. We talked a lot about enterprise risk and enterprise risk management many times, and it seems as though a lot of the attendees here have an enterprise risk management program, and they feel strongly that their food safety programs do tie and integrate to their ERM process at their corporate level. That's fantastic. I'll say it again, that's fantastic. That doesn't happen everywhere. And so pat yourselves on the back for having that integration already. For those who weren't sure where they stood with regard to, are my food safety programs really truly tied to the enterprise level risks that they're watching at the C-suite, at the board level? This is what we're really talking about. I mean, enterprise risk management in its in its nutshell is a process. It's a process to be able to help us make better decisions based on risk, to be able to better allocate our finite resources. So it helps us identify potential risks, manage them to basically our corporate risk tolerance and or to regulatory requirements. Sometimes we have to manage these risks down to zero because there's zero tolerance. Sometimes we have to manage these risks down to a certain part per million or part per billion because there's some threshold flexibility there. But ultimately, it's to be able to identify a process, identify risks, manage them, reduce those risks or eliminate them to a point that it gives us a reasonable confidence level that we're managing these risks. And we have some metrics to be able to show ourselves and others that we indeed are in control of these risks. So, punchline is enterprise risk management is a way to understand all the risks relative to other risks that the organization has to balance. And for better or for worse, we're competing against some other risks that our organization simply also has to manage, mitigate, reduce, and eliminate, because multiple different kinds of risks can ultimately conclude in what is known as a material balance sheet risk. Could this jeopardize the survivability of your company? Sometimes a food safety hazard absolutely could. A big recall associated with foodborne illness outbreaks, a lot of product, a lot of key customers we lose, those numbers add up, and they can be and have been material in history of recalls and outbreaks. But this process really was put in place out of the wake of financial crises of the early 2000s, the Enrons, the Arthur Andersons. And so this definition has been somewhat evolved and coined out of that financial need for internal controls, that financial need to manage risk from a financial loss perspective. But again, absolutely, food safety becomes one of those risks for certain. So I mentioned that we're kind of in competition with some other departments, some other colleagues, some other risks associated with enterprise risk and getting the resources that we need. And some of these competitors, if you will, might be your IT department, might be marketing. If we are risking customer loss, sales of a key product, for example. It could be labor, union, HR types of issues, right? Clearly, we're in the midst of COVID-19, employee safety, and the importance and criticality of that also become very big risks at your C-suite and board level. There's a lot of Jenga to be played. There's a lot of chess to be played to be able to manage all of these risks appropriately, right? And so sometimes when we can start to translate the hazards we have to manage every day, what we synonymously interchange between hazard and risk, to be able to communicate that in terms of metrics and dollars to that C-suite to vie for those very limited funds becomes incredibly useful, helpful, and is a large measure the journey of moving towards integration of your food safety program to your enterprise risk program level. This is an example of how one company whose identity has been redacted, lets the world know, hey, we have an enterprise risk management program. Food safety is a part of that. This is what we do. This is required for publicly traded companies to follow these laws. Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, Dodd-Frank, reporting of material risks in their quarterly reports, right? So whether you're private or public, integrating your food safety management programs like your EMP program into enterprise risk can become an extremely useful tool to let not only internally your internal stakeholders know you're on top of the game managing risk, but also external stakeholders and the consuming public. A little slow in the transition of these slides, apologies. Okay, here's an example. What are we talking about? So here's an example here, but even let's think about the example that Dr. Weidman gave earlier with regard to maybe you're challenged in getting the funding or the budget you need to do a sanitation validation of a key piece of equipment. So you can think about that as the, you know, the risk or the hazard, right? But let's start with the hazard in the left-hand column and say, all right, we know we have a hazard or a risk, if you will, of Listeria in the environment. You know, what does that look like? Why is that important? Why would someone give us funding to say, I need to increase the amount of testing that I'm doing to stay on top of this hazard? Well, we can make some assumptions. Yes, this is a bit of a back of the napkin calculation, and you may not have numbers down to the decimal point, but you can make some very educated decisions and assumptions based upon, all right, what's my low and my high end risk of an operational risk or an operational impact? I got downtime, for example. I would think the low end in a lot of companies would be, all right, this issue impacted one line one day. I can run some numbers on the product value of that production that might be at jeopardy. I might have to dispose of or destroy because maybe I caught something early, but it's still an operational disruption that's quantifiable in dollars. Maybe my high end is this impacts the entire plant, multiple days production. If I'm an FDA facility, maybe it's back to the last clean break. So it's multiple days. I can run some numbers based upon what I know about, you know, product value, customer contracts, things like that. So these numbers, you know, forget the numbers, just remember where you can get the numbers from, I think becomes very important. You can do the same with regulatory risks. You know, what is the financial or the monetary risk of a one line, one day, not only the downtime, but the downtime plus the cost of the recall, the reverse logistics, the communications, the customer penalties in your contracts, the list goes on, right? Lastly, what's the reputational risk? Is it, you know, we can read a lot of different surveys and studies that indicate to us that there's a loss of consumer trust after a certain period of time after a major class 1 recall, particularly involving illnesses. Maybe that's 3 months and a 30% loss of your sales. You know, and then that could be all the way up to you lose key customers permanently, you lose the product from the market, and the product has to be killed, in other words. Make some assumptions, do some back of the math, you know, back of the napkin math, because this becomes powerful to be able to have the conversation, walk into a C-suite, an audit committee, a CFO, and in a very limited time to be able to translate a hazard to a risk and say, and here's the way to mitigate it. I need $20,000 to do a process valid or to do a sanitation validation to be able to manage a risk of $10 million. Pretty soon it's like, here's the check, sir or madam. Like, who do I write it out to? And that's really the goal here in trying to teach us these kinds of conversational translations. So lastly, to close, some risk landmines. Again, some other considerations about whether to swab or not to swab. I think we're all saying here, swabbing is good. Having a robust, challenged, and comprehensive EMP program is an excellent way to mitigate your risk enterprise-wide. But think about some things in advance. So when inspectors show up and they're doing swabathons, what is your duplicate swab policy? Don't make it up on the fly. Think through it. There's different ways companies handle this. Some take duplicate swabs and tests, some don't. Some just log where the swab was taken by the regulator. But have a policy beforehand and no eyes wide open, and have your people trained on how to approach that situation. Also, you know, they teach us in law school, kind of don't ask the question you don't already know the answer to, right? Be careful what you ask. If you start testing for new pathogens, new organisms that you haven't been in the past, there's a certain element of risk to that. Now, time to time, there's a certain reason to have to do that, but let's think through how to do that wisely, how to do that perhaps under a risk assessment, under either attorney-client privilege or outside of your normal EMP routine sampling, so that that documentation doesn't have to be included in that. So truly, I guess what I'm advocating is adopt a test yet protect approach. Think about how to get the information you need. Don't bury your head in the sand, but do it in a way that protects not only your company, your operational, your regulatory, and your reputational risk, but also your consumers. And, you know, really, if we're not watching all of those risks, operational, regulatory, and reputational risk, those three words start with O-R and R, right? And to me, I feel like we're up a creek without one. We're up a creek without an R if we're not watching all of those risks at the same time on an enterprise level to say, you know what, the hazards we control in food safety are equally, if not more important than a lot of these other risks in the organization that have to be mitigated and reduced. You know, certainly that to be said, but we're certainly not on the B list. We shouldn't be on the bench. And, you know, here are some ways to show that. So lastly, just to recap, you know, our key takeaways and goals is really to you know, have a better understanding of how your EMP program does fit into enterprise risk management, and some tools and tricks and some back of the napkin calculations of how to translate hazard to risk. And watching out for landmines, and then go back to your facilities, go back to your programs and look at the current metrics you're using. Do they answer the call? Do they effectively monitor the hazards and the risk you really do have to have to keep your finger on the pulse of going forward? And if not, you sometimes get what you measure, right? So let's take a look at the metrics and then work our way backwards as well. With that, I am going to take this back to, or give this back to Amy at the Perry Johnson Registrar team. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Melanie. Let me go ahead, and before we get into Q&A, I'll give you guys some time to get any of those last questions that Melanie's slides might have inspired, get those typed in and sent off so we can respond to those. We do have one last polling question just to wrap things up, and that just has to do with what other webinars you might be interested in seeing. You know, we're always open to suggestions. You can always go to pjfsi.com and, you know, visit our contact us page, send us an email, give us a call and say, hey, I'd like to see a webinar on this topic. You know, we've got 5 months of webinars planned now. So there's always room for more in the future. If you don't see something on our list of upcoming that you're interested in, please go ahead and suggest one. So we'll wait for some of those to come in. And in the meantime, I'm just going to give a brief rundown of our webinars in the next week or so. We've got an ethical trade and responsible sourcing webinar on Tuesday the 16th with Jessica Burke and Paula Parejo of BRCGS. On the 18th, that's a Thursday, we have a effectively communicating risks from the shop floor to the boardroom webinar, and that's with Neil Marshall of Gov Consulting International LLC and Janice Stoitzis, the co-founder and chief information officer of AgroKnow. And then on the 23rd, that's a Tuesday, we have a detailed overview of FSVP and FSMA, a recap of 2020 and expectations for 2021. And that's with our frequent guest and friend of the show, Jen Crandall from Safe Food en Route. So thank you to everyone who responded to that polling question. You can see a full list of all of our upcoming webinars at pjfsi.com/webinars. We're still adding some information on other upcoming ones that don't necessarily have a finalized title or description, but keep checking back for updates. And now we're going to get right into the Q&A. So let me go ahead and open up the questions tab. I've seen some questions popping in as we've been going through the slides. All right, and I do apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. It's not my strongest point, but we do have a question here from Mark, and Mark is asking, in regards to sanitation validation, only Zone 1 contact areas, and I'm guessing this means that it only applies to Zone 1 contact areas. Martin, maybe you have some commentary on this?
That's a really good question. I mean, if you look at a large facility, right, I mean, you could validate sanitation conceptually of everything, of your food contact equipment, your slicer, your filler, but you could also validate, sanitation of your drains, for example. That's costly, time consuming. So practically speaking, I would start out with my food contact equipment, with my highest risk equipment. But if your general environment is high risk, you could validate those parts too. But very few people do this. What I see mostly people validating is their food contact equipment.
All right, we've got a question here from Iqbal. And that question is Salmonella considered an environmental bacteria?
Very good question, and the short answer is absolutely yes. I think some of us, I'm trained as a veterinarian 25 years ago, Salmonella was always considered like, you had to have an animal there, it was raw meat. But we know that Salmonella can survive in dry facilities for 15, 20 years, whether it's chocolate facility, whether it's dry dairy powders, whether it's flour plants, etc. So chocolate plants, etc. So yes, it is environmentally transmitted. There are certain facilities which are high risk. I've heard some people say that they think that essentially every chocolate facility has a resident Salmonella that survives in the facility over years. The question is just whether you know that you have it or you don't. Even in the outside the processing facility, if you look at field level, Salmonella can survive in sediment of streams, ponds, in the soil for really extended time. So we have to consider Salmonella as an environmentally transmitted pathogen, absolutely.
All right, we've got a question from Amanda here. How do you best determine locations for swabbing and which organism to test at the given location?
So let's start with the easy one first. Which organism? I mean, as I said, big Salmonella and Listeria, two big targets. It's going to have to be a risk assessment. If it's a dry environment, you tend to mainly focus on Salmonella. Could be 80, 90% of your swabs are Salmonella. 10, 20 are Listeria, sometimes less. If it's a wet environment, you typically tend to focus more on Listeria. And then it also depends on the characteristics of your food. If you have a ready-to-eat food that allows for Listeria growth, which is then increases the risk of that food causing an outbreak, or human cases, you're gonna even more focus on Listeria. So that's relatively easy. More difficult of where to sample. Typically, a good facility might have a list of 100, 200, 500, even more sampling sites, general sampling sites, and they rotate through them randomly. That a subset is picked every week when they sample. This requires experience. If you have no experience with environmental sampling plans, you might want to bring in an outside expert to help you with that sampling list. It is also a good idea to review the sampling list. One thing that I forgot to mention, but it's also important, is you typically want to let your sampling staff, the people who collect the samples, give them a couple of freebies. So say, every week you take 20 samples, but you're going to get 15 from a sample list. You can take 5 more at spots that look suspicious. Wet areas, new areas that just look like Listeria is there. And that's a continuous training where you want to bring in experts to get the best sampling sites. I've actually published a paper that lists good sampling sites. If someone's interested, and feel free to contact me and we can get you started on some lists of generally good sampling sites.
Fantastic.
And this is Melanie, Amy, just to kind of chime in on the which organism to monitor and test for. In part, don't lose sight of, for example, FDA's guidance documents in Appendix 1 that actually lists by product the biological, chemical, and physical hazards that FDA has already, through its own risk assessment, determined should likely be monitored. So unless and until you have enough of your own data to prove otherwise, that regulator and the inspector coming into your next inspection may very well assume and expect you to be monitoring for certain microorganisms based upon that Appendix 1 of FDA's draft guidance documents on hazards that require a preventive control.
Yeah, that's a great point about the FDA, Melanie. Thanks. It looks like there's a question. I believe this came in during your portion of the slides, Melanie, so maybe you can speak on this one. This is a question from Rohit. They actually have 2, so I'll do the first one first. He has a question on risk curves. The probabilities to be assigned for risk to materialize are largely unknown and are very low. Is there a better way to quantify?
And that might be also something that Dr. Weidman can chime in on. I know he and his team do a lot of risk modeling with data, whether a Monte Carlo simulation or some other type of modeling can be used. But I think the key from an enterprise risk perspective is quantification, right? It's finding some way to look at risks in an apples to apples kind of way. And there's a lot of different ways, models, curves, opportunities in order to accomplish that. What, at least to me, makes the most sense is that you're aligned internally in your organization. If, again, going back to the example of if you have 17 production facilities you're monitoring, we're all the way up and all the way down, having a common definition of what means what, and how you are monitoring and quantifying those risks is going to become very important versus having variability or no definition or everything being solely qualitative.
This is Martin. So this is definitely one of the most challenging questions of translating hazards into risk, is like these low-level risks, right? And we're talking food safety incidents, 1 every 10 years, 1 every 5 years, maybe even 1 every 20 years. And there are different ways to approach that. You need to make some assumptions. But one way to give an example, say, hey, FDA will collect this many samples. That means the likelihood of us getting sampled is this often. If you have 1% of our product positive, it's never going to be all negative. This is what the likelihood is. You could look at it in terms of recalls. You say our industry segment has had 5 recalls over the last year. We are 20% of the segment. This is our likelihood. You need to see what works for you, and you need to make some assumptions. But, remember, you're going to compete for budget against, your IT people, against your marketing people. They make assumptions all the time. They're perfectly happy saying, what the risk of a cyber attack is, it's 1 every 5 years and going to cost us $20 million. Absolutely zero science behind it. Food safety tends to have scientists, and we get way too hung up in this case about saying, well, how sure are we? We can't really say what the risk is. Do the best you can with the deck you dealt. If you can, bring in someone that can help you think through it and come up with a defensible metrics, but something that's going to have some uncertainty around it.
Great, thank you so much, Martin. Rohit did share a follow-up. He was waiting for you to mention Monte Carlo, so well answered there. The other question that had come from Rohit was just a general request for more commentary on ACP, if you could explain that more. ACP,
someone help me.
Yeah, Rohit, if you could clarify. Oh, attorney-client privilege, Melanie, help us out here.
There we go.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were going for ATP or
right.
No, there's some companies who might be introducing a new product line, doing a line extension, adding new ingredients they've never handled in that facility before, trying to get either a baseline of a new hazard maybe they haven't monitored or tested for before, right? They may think they may have a unique hazard emerging or arising. It's starting from the very beginning of that risk assessment to say, hey, I need to start doing some testing for this new, microbiological organism I haven't tested for before. Don't just willy-nilly go start at zone 1, because you could get yourself into a world of hurt, right? It's working with, your food safety leadership, your general counsel or your in-house counsel, and if you don't have one, perhaps an external counsel, to structure that risk assessment in a way that isn't trying to hide anything from anyone, but it is structured in a way to protect the information to allow you to test in that flexible, free way you need to in order to understand a situation, but not walk yourself right into a recall as a result of that. So by having attorneys involved, having them direct traffic, direct the workflow of that risk assessment for that new sampling, for example, there are ways to structure it in a way that gives a heightened opportunity for protection of that information, that it isn't necessarily a part of your routine environmental monitoring program that is fair game to be reviewed by every auditor, inspector, customer, etc.
I have another quick one on that one. I've seen companies very reluctant for me to do a risk assessment and tell them, you know, with your product, with your current profile, you're probably going to make about 10 people sick in a given year with this one product. They don't want to have records of that. So to do some of those risk assessments where I report to an attorney and then they report to the company to shield this from discovery, because as soon as you have a discoverable document that says you actually knew that you might make someone sick and that the risk is not zero, yeah, some judges and some juries might not look at that very favorably if something happens. So you might want to shield even some of these risk assessments.
All right, thank you both. I know we've run over a little bit on our expected scheduled time. I just wanted to throw one more question out there. It's actually two questions that I think they go hand in hand. And these are from Juan Carlos and Rashidat. And I would phrase it like this. The first part of the question, when is the best time to swab, before or after cleaning? And then Juan Carlos had made the point, why swab after applying sanitizer? Is it not a better practice to swab after cleaning and before sanitizing to validate the cleaning procedure rather than the efficacy of the sanitizer? Any thoughts on that?
It absolutely depends on what you want to do. If you're trying to validate your cleaning and sanitation, you're going to sample after cleaning and sanitation. Now, you can separate out your validation of cleaning and your validation of sanitation. ATP validates cleaning, total plate count validates sanitation. So you could do it after, you could do ATP after cleaning and then after, and then do total plate count after sanitation. For your routine verification, that happens during processing. So I don't think there's any wrong answers. It's really, what is the goal of the program? Is it validation, verification? Are you targeting cleaning? Are you targeting sanitation? If you're doing a root cause analysis, it's going to be a completely different ballgame when you sample. So not one answer. It's really driven by your goals.
All right, so pretty flexible thing there. All right, thank you again, everyone who attended. Thank you for all of the great questions there. And thank you to our presenters for joining us. Really, it's a great honor to have you on the call for a webinar with our clients, our friends and family of the company. If you have any closing words, Martin, Melanie, before we wrap up.
Nothing for me, thank you.
Nor me, other than to say thanks.
Same with me, Amy. I just want to thank Mel and Dr. Weidman as well for your time very much. It's a true honor to share the stage with you. And Amy, as always, great job. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, if you missed part of the presentation or if you want to share the recording with someone who was unable to attend, you can find both of those at pjrfsi.com, and we'd be happy to take any feedback. You can contact us through the website. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon. Stay safe and stay healthy out there. Thank you all.